Hi there. Today's lecture is on the digestive system in agriculturally important animals. This is a pretty important topic for us because we know enough about biology to know that when the digestive system of an animal is not healthy, there are typically other ways the animal is unhealthy. In every animal, from humans on down to any other species, the digestive system health has a big effect on the health of an animal. What you see on this first slide is a picture of what is called a fistulated cow. Fistulated simply means that there is a hole that is surgically made and maintained in a healthful way. You can see there it even has a lid, but when needed, you can take the lid off and have access to just the rumen of the cow. And that's important because of the microbial population that exists in the rumen. Sometimes if another beef animal is sick from a digestive purpose, they can actually use some of that digestive fluid to raise their health. So we'll talk more about that when we talk about polygastrics. We're going to talk about 4 different digestive systems, but the purpose in each of them is the same, and that is simply to take these large complex molecules of food and break them down into simple ones that can be used as energy for the animal. In every one of the 4 types of species we look at, when we talk about the digestive system, we're talking about starting at the mouth, so some sort of tool like teeth as a prehension tool, and ending with the anus where waste is defecated out. Each of the systems we're going to talk about have a few things in common, and so I'd like to cover a couple of those to begin with because we'll start there every time. The first is that every mammal, actually every animal we're studying has a mouth, and a mouth is considered a prehension tool in that it grasps the food. If you even contemplate on your own human experience, you know that there is saliva in your mouth. And so the glands that exist in animals' mouths secrete juice that contains some enzymes that begin the digestion of food. And so that saliva has a pretty important purpose. Now, the purpose of teeth is then to break apart the cellulosic and structural nature of food, which is why some food requires more chewing than others. The vast majority of the animals we look at today are going to be animals that eat a lot of grass, and so we're thinking about how do you break that plant cell wall down so that the energy can be taken out from the plants. The second thing that each system has is an esophagus. In my mind, when I think about an esophagus, I'm actually picturing like a vacuum hose, because basically an esophagus is a muscular tube that connects the mouth and the stomach, but the muscles are formatted in these little ring-like areas, and they contract in sequence. And so for all intents and purposes, then those contractions push the food down into the stomach. So if you have a snack with you, this is a great time for you to like take a bite of it and swallow a bite. And you'll actually, if you pay attention, be able to feel those little muscles in your esophagus kind of push the food down into your stomach. When it's going down, we call that peristaltic movement. On the occasion when that food comes back up from your stomach, we call that reverse peristalsis. It's much longer and more intensive to say than vomiting, so you'll never hear anyone yell from their bedroom, "Mom, I'm reverse peristalsising." They'd say, "No, Mom, I'm puking. Help me." There are 4 digestive systems that we're going to look at today, and we're actually going to start with your human experience. The first one will be monogastric. The second one will be a polygastric. We often also use the word ruminant with that. Those animals have 4 compartments in their stomach, and it enables them to eat some things and turn them into high-quality protein that other animals can't. We'll study modified monogastrics that have 1 stomach but an enlarged cecum, so they have an ability to digest roughages better than monogastrics. And then finally, we'll take a look at the avian digestive system so that you can understand how the crop and the gizzard help chickens and other birds exist. Now, first off, that previous slide is probably worth going back to and making sure you really have that in your notes, because we in animal science have a really bad habit of using all those terms interchangeably. You'll hear somebody talk about a ruminant or a polygastric, and then you'll hear somebody else talk about, a simple stomach or a monogastric. So I want you to know and understand how those are congruent or not congruent. But the way most human brains connect to this is to have an example of an animal for each of those species, each of those systems. So for monogastrics, it's you and pigs, and then also dogs and cats have simple stomachs. That also means, because the stomach is so simple, that there has to be a pretty extensive intestinal system. And monogastrics, in most cases, require high-quality protein to maintain good health. You have to have it in the diet. Polygastrics are also ruminants. They have a very complex stomach system, but a very simple intestinal system. This would include sheep, cattle, deer, and elk. Any animal that does a lot of grazing, and that's the majority of their food. And what is special about that system is that the cellulosic matter actually spends a lot of time in those compartments of the stomach, and these microbes eat it, the microbes die, and they are the protein source for the animal. And then finally, we have a modified monogastric, which it can be included in horses and rabbits. Pretty simple stomach and an extensive intestinal system. And in between the large and small intestine, this enlarged cecum, which acts as an additional digestive vat. So they also can eke out that nutrition from roughages. I didn't put avian on here because I think we all understand that bird digestive systems are in birds. I guess I did put it on there. Let's talk first about monogastrics. So in your notes, you'll want to do two things, and hopefully I've seen you in person, so I've given you examples, but if I haven't, this will be much easier if you actually have printed off a diagram of a monogastric, and you can make some arrows as well as take some notes. So there are three pieces in monogastric digestion that we want to make sure you understand, because this is where the nutrients are absorbed. So when things leave the stomach, where they've been kind of soaking in gastric juice, if you will, the food is broken down, but the small intestine's job then is to absorb all those nutrients from that digested feed. And so inside your small intestine, there are all of these cilia, and they're like little finger-like protrusions, if you will, and that gives them more surface area to digest those nutrients, or to absorb them, rather. You then have an area of your intestines between the small and large that is called the cecum, and that's that secondary digestion vat, where it's like, oh, I got most of the nutrients out, but I need to digest it a little bit more to get more. In simple digestive systems, the cecum is rather small. And then finally, the large intestine's job is to absorb most of the water out of your food and then make the fecal matter more compact. And so this is an area that's very important, because if it doesn't work, it's pretty easy for an animal to get dehydrated. Hopefully you've been looking at this diagram, and I think this is a really great time for you to get out a colored pencil, a marker, or a pen, whatever, and draw some arrows that help you remember, the food comes in through the mouth and then goes through the esophagus, spends time being digested and broken down in the stomach, then through the small intestines, where the nutrients are absorbed, a little bit of secondary digestion going on in the cecum, but then out the large intestine, where water is absorbed, finally through the colon and then the rectum to leave the animal as waste. The simple digestive system is simple. It's pretty much in a straight line and things go in one direction. Within the stomach, there are a few things, and I think this slide's actually a little bit out of order. I should move that. Before we go into the intestines, the simple stomach has a lot that goes on in it, and so there are muscular contractions that kind of squeeze and crunch that food. And then the enzymes have a very low pH, which makes them very acidic, and that's what breaks down the food. In the stomach, we begin to break down those proteins more, but the liver and the pancreas also do a lot to help break down fats. One of the ties that I like for us humans to make to this is that the gastric acid that is in your stomach, it has such a low pH that it actually burns some of your other organs when it's not in your stomach. And so the best analogy is actually to think about the eating disorder bulimia. In the eating disorder bulimia, when you throw up, that gastric acid comes into your throat a lot. And your throat has a natural secretion of kind of some slime, some phlegm, if you will, that protects it from that. But if it happens repeatedly, it actually can begin to eat the tissue. And that's part of why when you vomit, you sometimes have a sore throat, because it's that gastric acid. So we want to be very careful and keep the gastric acid in the stomach, because that organ is built to house it without disturbing or breaking down the tissue. Okay, next we're going to go to polygastric digestion. I'm going to bump ahead just a little bit so that you can also get a diagram ready. We're going to use the idea of a cow, but remember that a polygastric could be cattle, sheep, deer, elk, any of those things. And if you remember right, a polygastric is going to indicate that we have multiple compartments to the stomach. Sometimes people make the mistake of saying they have 4 stomachs. They actually don't. It's all one container, if you will, with separate compartments in it. Polygastric digestion begins very similarly to monogastric. So we start with the mouth. The teeth are prehension tools, break things down. It goes down the esophagus. Remember the vacuum hose of the little muscles that contract in order. And as it is dumped down into the stomach, it kind of goes over and allows anything that needs to fall into the reticulum. The reticulum is the front compartment of the rumen. And if you look at that diagram, you can see how the esophagus just kind of dumps it down in there. And the purpose of the reticulum is to have this honeycomb texture in kind of a pouch where anything the cow or the ruminant should not have eaten can fall in there and stay. The best way for my brain to understand it is to think about maybe a small piece of tie wire, metal wire that came off a fence. A steer accidentally eats it and swallows it down there. If it were to go all the way through the digestive system, it actually could potentially kill the steer. And there are times when we talk about that being, hardware disease or something like that. But if it just falls down into the rumen, it can stay in that pouch. And actually, in many cases, eventually the gastric acid will make it rust into just minerals and go away. In higher cost cows like dairy cows that are producing milk all the time, so they're kept in very careful health, they'll actually give cattle a magnet as a food source, and it's like a soft-edged round magnet, and they want it to fall down in the reticulum and attract all those metal pieces to it, so there's no chance that if something got in the feed, it would go on through the system and kill that animal. So the reticulum is very important in terms of like catching anything that shouldn't be there. Now, if you look at the diagram, what really happens is the food goes down the esophagus. The heavy things that needed to could fall into the reticulum, but all of that other grass and food stuff, hay, if you will, kind of floats around in the rumen for just a little bit. And it's clumped into these kind of chunks, if you will, and it actually forms these kind of raft-like shapes that float in the rumen fluid. And in a full-grown beef animal, it's actually quite a lot of fluid. The pH of that that acid is pretty low, just like it would be in a monogastric system, so it begins to eat up some of those things or break them down. Now, this is where a polygastric becomes very different than a monogastric, because at this point they experience reverse peristalsis and bring some of that grass back up into the mouth area and re-chew it. We call this chewing their cud. Now, there are two important things for you to know about chewing their cud. One is that an animal will never chew its cud unless it's in a low-stress situation. And that chewing its cud is very important to digestion. So cattle, other animals need that time in the day where they can go lay down and be relaxed. And the nervous system will tell the body, hey, we're safe, we're chill, we can go ahead and digest our food, because then they'll bring that cud back up and chew it. It breaks the cellulosic nature of this poor quality forage down into smaller pieces. They swallow it again, and it goes back down into the rumen. Now, inside the rumen, there's this huge vat of gastric juice, but also it is chocked full of microbic populations. And those microbes actually eat the low-quality forage food that the cow just chewed up and swallowed. So the reason that polygastrics or ruminants or cattle can just live off grass and still get all the protein they need is that they swallow the grass, and it's actually the microbes that eat the grass. Well, the microbes have a very short life cycle, so then they go ahead and die. As the microbes go through the digestive system, they are the protein. And so that enables cattle to eat very low quality feed, turn it into or make their own high quality protein, and then in turn make high quality beef. So things float around in the rumen. Then the chunks of hay or grass, as well as the dead microbes floating around, actually go into the omasum. The omasum sometimes is called many plies. Those muscles contract, it squishes and breaks the feed down mechanically, and then it finally ends up in the abomasum. The abomasum is really the only part of the cattle digestive system that's like your stomach, and this is where then digestion begins to happen. The animal digests the microbes, which are full of protein, but also gets some carbohydrates from that existing hay and grass that's there, and then begins to absorb those nutrients in the intestines. Now, I want to really quickly go back a couple of slides. I will put these links, they're actually in the slide deck that's also here on Google Classroom. These are both really cool videos that kind of talk you through the graphics. You might find those beneficial. But go ahead and mark on your diagrams that kind of that back and forth with some arrows. I know it gets real confusing, but I think it will help you remember if you trace that with a pen or pencil that it goes down the esophagus, through the reticulum into the rumen, back up, is chewed again, back down, but this time it generally then goes into the omasum, is squished up more, then the abomasum, and finally into the small, then large intestine until it becomes fecal matter. And that brings us to a modified monogastric. Another video clip that I like to show in class when I can make the technology work, that basically shows you how a modified monogastric really is between our simple systems, monogastrics, and our polygastrics. Now, in terms of species, the two main modified monogastrics you'll become familiar with are horses and rabbits. In both of these scenarios, they eat a fair amount of forage, but there really is no rumen to have that microbial population do its thing. And so instead, there is a microbial population and a secondary digestion vat in what we call the cecum between the large and small intestines. One of the remarkable things I think about in the digestive system of a horse is just its pure magnitude. If you will look at your diagram, you'll be able to label some things as we go. But if you do some quick addition here, you can find out and realize that we're talking more than 100 feet of digestive system in a horse. Even just the esophagus can be up to 4 or 5 feet long. In horses, we use the term foregut and hindgut. The foregut is actually referring to the stomach, so what we would consider a simple stomach. The hindgut is referring to that enlarged cecum. And when you add all those up, it is a very long distance. Now, I bring that up because that long distance of digestive organs is crammed into the torso of a horse, and that makes it very susceptible to what we call colic. Colic simply means that at some point in that system, there is a blockage, usually via a twist or something like that, that causes feed to back up and will not let digestion continue, which results in waste leaving the horse's body. It's painful. You often see them kicking at their stomach or rolling around. But it makes a little bit of sense if you think biologically about the amount of linear feet that we've crammed into that horse's body, or that biology has, if you will, of pure digestive organs. And so colic is probably the number one health problem we experience in horses. The joke amongst people who have been around horses with colic is that you just have to keep moving the guts around until the blockage breaks loose. And so oftentimes that's by walking them. Sometimes it's by a bouncy horse trailer ride. Sometimes the horse can roll around and get their organs back in the right spot, but there's always this huge sense of relief when a horse that's been sick with colic begins to poop again. In terms of the modified monogastric digestion, the stomach works the same way as in a monogastric, and the small and large intestines also work the same way. Small intestines is going to be mostly nutrient absorption. Large intestine is going to be more absorption of water. We just do a secondary kind of digestive vat in between. And so that means that the large intestine in horses does still absorb some nutrients. Now, what I've given you is like the 2-minute overview version. If you'll refer back to this YouTube video here, comes from one of the equine science college professors. Great resource for you to watch because it's actually far more complex than that. And people who study equine digestion really have a lot to add to that conversation. Last system that we want to look at is called avian, and this is chickens and bird digestive systems. There are some similarities, believe it or not, to other digestive systems, but also some big differences. To begin with, chickens don't have teeth. They instead have a teeth-like serration system on their jaw. And so that's important because as they pick things up off the ground, they actually use their jaws to try and break them open when possible. But essentially the food then goes down the esophagus into the crop. The crop is not overly big on chickens because they're a relatively small animal, but it is, for all intents and purposes, a digestive vat. So it is where that gastric juice lives that has that low pH and begins to break apart their feedstuffs. Things stay in the crop for, I think, up to 12 hours. Things then go down through the proventriculus into the gizzard. Now, the gizzard is a really funny little organ, and this is the reason that chickens will eat rocks, sticks, and other hard things, is the gizzard provides muscular contractions, but it needs hard things in it to break apart the grains. So we've soaked the grains in the crop, and then those muscular contractions push against the rocks, the oyster shell, all those sorts of things, and they break apart the grains and then allow the animal to benefit from the protein and carbohydrates and fats that are in the feed. We then see those go through the pancreas and the liver, helping digest the fats and things like that. The small intestine is again where most of the absorption occurs, and then we go on through the to the ceca and the colon. Really, the colon is the only part that it would be your large intestine. And so you'll notice that chickens actually have fairly wet fecal matter because there isn't quite as much absorption of water that comes in that stage. Then go the fecal matter leaves out the cloaca. Now, if you were to overlay this with the reproductive system of a chicken, you would see that the same vent area where fecal matter leaves is also where the eggs leave, and sometimes that's why we then have need to do some cleaning of eggs before they're consumed. There's really great research and interesting things on that coating that is covering the egg when the egg is first laid, and how it provides some preservation of that. And so it's very common for people to leave them on the counter as long as they are unwashed. But then sometimes people also, if they're having trouble with keeping their eggs clean, need to wash them before they crack them so you don't risk getting fecal matter in your food. There is again in the slide deck, a link to a YouTube video that kind of goes through the digestion for chickens. But it's worth then talking about some of the organs that are common to all the animals, or reviewing those, if you will. And I think we talked about these, but maybe you haven't added them to your notes. Each of those animals has a small intestine that connects the stomach to the large intestine. The big purpose here is absorption of minerals, and then we know that they're covered with villi to help absorb, to give more surface area. Secondarily, we have the large intestine. The large intestine includes different parts to it, so we actually have the name of rectum, where the fecal matter comes out. We have the colon, and then we have the cecum. It depends on the species and the type of system as to which one is which. All of them have in common that they absorb the water, and they make vitamin, and they also continue to absorb vitamins and minerals here. Do note that especially in the horse, the large intestine continues to absorb nutrients because they are cecal fermenters, or some people call them hindgut fermenters. Basically, it's that modified monogastric that acts like a rumen. There are some accessory organs that also are important to every digestive system, and I believe I mentioned this earlier, but just to reiterate that the pancreas secretes enzymes to break down fats and make those available as caloric energy. In addition, the liver, which is one of your largest internal organs, secretes bile, which helps digest those fats. So the liver and pancreas are very important in both cases as well. As we really quickly go through these diagrams again, it's worth noting that there's a direct link to the digestive system and how much energy it takes to power it, and then what that means in terms of food efficiency. So most of the animals that we are raising for agricultural purposes are being raised for high quality protein as a food source. Obviously, the exception in America would be horses, but the question becomes, how much feed does it take to make 1 pound of muscle? And we call that an animal's efficiency factor. If you think about the steps in digestion, there's a direct link to efficiency and how long or how intricate digestion is. So we'll start here with swine. Typically, swine require about 3 pounds of feed to create 1 pound of muscle. It really makes them a pretty moderate, efficient animal. When we move into the polygastric, we actually see that go up in cattle up to 8 pounds for 1 pound of muscle. Now, the difference here that you have to consider before you freak out about why are we putting so much feed into cattle is that we are typically using lower quality feeds which could not be human food. The example I give that's close to your hearts is, I can't take you up and say, hey, raise a corn crop on the Grand Mesa, because then we can feed it directly to humans instead of wasting that efficiency on cattle, simply because there are some crops we can't grow in different climate areas. So while cattle aren't the most efficient, they are utilizing feed that other species, including us humans, cannot. Finally, then we get to chickens, and if you consider that, we see that chickens usually have an efficiency factor of about 2 pounds to 1 pound of meat, and so they're pretty efficient. That also makes them less expensive to raise. Not included in this digestive system presentation, but worth knowing is the fact that the most efficient animal protein source is actually fish. That fish typically take about 1.1 pound of feed to create 1 pound of muscle. So that efficiency factor is good for you to know and important for people to know as they consider their own nutrition. This is a lot of information. Reach out with what questions you have, and happy studying. Have a good day.